Hi everyone, my name is Dina and I'm part of the Immerse team at UCSB. In this tutorial, I'll be going over an introduction to R and RStudio. To access all the materials that you need for our tutorials, you can visit our GitHub. It's immerse-UCSB. And then here you can see our GitHub. We have 4 repositories right now. The one that we'll be using for this tutorial is Intro to RStudio. And the best way to download it is to click code and then download zip. And then you should see a folder that looks like this. And then I'll go over all the contents of the folder as we go throughout the tutorial. The number one thing that would be useful is to open up the HTML file and you'll see this Markdown. And myself. This has everything that I'll be going over in this video, so it would be helpful to follow along with this. Okay. To outline what I'll be talking about for this video, it'll be divided into 3 parts. In part 1, I'll go over installing R, RStudio, and M+. We will not use M+ in this tutorial, but just to show you how to get access to it. In part 2, I'll go over RStudio's interface, creating an R project and R Markdown, R packages, and in part 3, I'll read in a data set, do some data screening and cleaning procedures, and some descriptive statistics. So I'm going to walk through this Markdown to give you an idea of how the tutorial is going to go. At the top, you'll see some information on the Immerse project. It's an IES-funded training grant. You can visit our website, follow us on Twitter, and then again, visit our GitHub account. All the tutorials will have this information, so you can refer back to it at any time. So this is part 1 of Intro to R and RStudio. So we're going to install R, RStudio, and M+. Again, we'll not be using M+ for this tutorial. But it'll just show you how to download it because we will be using it in future videos. The first thing you want to do is install both R and RStudio. R is the language, and then RStudio is the interface. So make sure you have both of those installed. And then with M+, you want to make sure you're at the Stat Model website, and you can go ahead and download the M+ software for whichever machine you have. We do require, or the tutorials require, that you have the M+ mixture add-on component. It is a paid license, though Immerse Fellows will be given their own copy of M+ for use during the 1-year training. So after you have installed our RStudio, we can go ahead and move on to part 2. Part 2 will be going over R projects, packages, and Markdown. So once you have R and RStudio downloaded, if you open up RStudio, you should have something come up that looks like this. You'll see 3 windows. In this first window, this is called the console. In the console, you can type code directly in the console. However, the downside of doing that is you are not able to save your work. You can install packages in the console because you don't need to save that script. Something you can do is just quickly do some calculations like I showed before. But the console is helpful if you need to do something quick. In the environment window, you'll see that it's empty right now, but when we read in data sets, that information will show up here. And then in the bottom right window, it has a few tabs that would be helpful for you as you are working with RStudio. You'll have your files, the plots will show up here, the packages that you have. The help tab is helpful for understanding functions and certain packages, and there's a viewer and presentation mode tab. So to create an R project, we would go to File and New Project. When you download the repository, you'll see that there isn't already an R project created for this tutorial. You can work with this directly, but I'm just going to show you how to create an R project. What an R project does is help us organize our folders, file paths, and scripts. So when you double click on this R project, your working directory is automatically wherever your R project is located. So that's helpful for us when we're working with a Markdown and we want to read in the data set. We don't have to specify a long file path. And you'll see what I mean as we go along. So to do this, we will go to File, New Project, New Directory, New Project, and then give a directory name or your project name, and we'll just call it Intro to RStudio. And then you can place it anywhere you'd like. I'm putting it on my desktop and in a folder called Immerse Training. And then you create project. And now you know you're in a project because up at the top it should say Intro to RStudio. I have the -Immerse Training at the end because I have two projects called Intro to RStudio, and it's just letting me know that this one is in the Immerse Training folder. The next thing we're going to do is create an R Markdown. This document that you are following along with was created with Markdown, and we'll show how to do that as we go along. To create an R Markdown, you want to go to New File and R Markdown, and then give it a title. We can say Introduction to R and RStudio, and we want to make sure our output format is HTML, and we can click OK. So now you'll see a new Markdown with some example text and code chunks. Usually what I do is delete everything from the line 10 and down because this is just a template. But before we do that, we can knit this Markdown to an HTML output just to get an idea of what we can create. So we want to go to knit and then HTML. It'll prompt us to save this Markdown, and I'm just going to call it Intro to RStudio. And so now we have knitted our Markdown with the example template. And that includes our name and the title we gave it when we initially created the Markdown. Okay, so just to quickly go over what the template contains, it gives us a level 2 header called R Markdown, and then some text. We can add a link here. And then some code chunks. A code chunk is this gray area where you would type in R code directly. So what this code chunk is doing is providing a summary of the data set called cars. The reason why we don't see the data set in this environment is because it's a base R data set and it's already within the RStudio framework. So when you click run on this code chunk, you can see what this function summary does. It gives us the min and max and the quartiles and the mean. We have another level 2 heading, some text, and then another code chunk. This time it's plotting the pressure data set. And this is letting us know that echo equals false is in our code chunk setup line, which prevents us of printing the R code that generated the plot. So when you open up that Markdown, what echo equals false does is does not print the code chunk in the final knitted document. Whereas here, since we don't have echo equals false, it does show up. But that's just to show you a little bit of what Markdown can do. So like I said, I usually just take all of the template out and then I start fresh. The next thing I'm going to do is load some packages and make sure we have some installed. The way to install packages is to go to the console and then type in install.packages, and then in parentheses, the package that we want installed. The first one we want is tidyverse, and that is the method of coding that is preferred for these tutorials. It's a collection of our packages designed for data science. Another package that we can download is the psych package. That package has a function called describe that gives us descriptive statistics of a data set. We also want to install here. That helps us with organizing file paths, which I'll show as we go along. And finally, we want to install the GT package, which helps with creating tables. This one's asking us to install or to restart R prior to installing, and I am clicking no just to speed up the process. Okay. So now that we've installed the packages, we have not loaded them. They're just installed, but we want to let R know that I want these packages loaded so I can use the functions that are within these packages. So the first thing that I'll do in our Markdown is create a new code chunk. And to insert a code chunk, you can use the keyboard shortcut Control-Alt-I or Command-Alt-I if you're on a Mac. Or you can click this green C block here and click R. You can also go to Code and insert code chunk. So there's a few ways to do it. I usually just like the keyboard shortcut, which is Control-Alt-I. And so to load in the packages, we want to use the library function, and we want to load in those packages that we downloaded. And every time you start a new R session, you have to load in your packages. And so now we want to run this code chunk. I made a typo in library, and now it should work. Okay, this is just tidyverse's way of letting us know which packages were attached, because it is a collection of packages, and then what the conflicts are. Sometimes there are functions with the same name as other packages, so it's letting us know which one is preferred when you're working in your Markdown. So for example, the dplyr package has a function called filter. It's masking the stats package as filter. So that's what these messages mean. Okay. So now that we have loaded the packages, we are going to move forward with exploring the data in part 3. Okay, and in part 3, we're going to explore the data. We'll look at the example that we'll be working with in a lot of our videos, and then look at some descriptive statistics and how to read in the data using R. If you're following along, I am in part 3 of the Markdown that is available on GitHub and for every video. Okay, so if you've gotten to this point right now, we have our project up and ready to go with our Markdown. And one thing that we need to do is move our data set that was available in our repository into your project folder. So right now your project folder only has the R project link, the Markdown, and then the knitted HTML from part 2. So now we want to add in the data set so we can work with that. What I usually like to do is just, let me open folders. Okay, so here is the folder that we're working with now. This is the R project that we created in this video, and this is the folder that was included in our repository. So this has everything, including the PDF, the PowerPoint that we were working with, and the data set. So I just like to copy and paste this into this other folder. So I just Control C and then Control V into this folder. And now you should see it here. And inside is the data set. So we'll be calling the data set from the data folder as we work through part 3. So the example that we'll be using in a lot of these videos is an example with the Civil Rights Data Collection Data Repository. It's called the CRDC. It's a federally mandated school level data collection effort that occurs every other year. And we'll be using some data in there as late in class indicators when we do mixture modeling in future videos. Right now, we're just going to observe the data set, look at the descriptive statistics, mainly just how to do it in R, and then as well as look at the information that the data set contains. So let's go ahead and get started and read in the data set. Before I do that, let's quickly review what the variables are. So we have 2 identification variables. That is the district identification code and then the school identification code. And then these are the indicators that we'll be working with. Number of students harassed or bullied on the basis of disability, on the basis of race, color, or national origin, bullied on the basis of sex. And then we have the number of full-time equivalent counselors hired as school staff, number of full-time equivalent psychologists hired as school staff, and the number of full-time equivalent law enforcement officers hired as school staff. So these will be valued at 0 or 1, 0 for no reported incidents or no staff present, 1 for at least 1 reported incident, and 1 for at least 1 staff present. So these are the variables that we'll be exploring in R. So the first thing we want to do is organize our Markdown. We can start by saying, using a level 2 header, read in data, and then we can add some text. This is where we will read in the CRDC data. And then to insert a code chunk, what we're going to do is read in the data inside a code chunk. So anything outside of the grade area is Markdown text. Anything in the gray area is R code. And to insert a code chunk, we'll do Control-Alt-I. And we will call our data object data. You can call it whatever you want after the arrow, in front of the arrow. But I usually just like to label it data. We will use the read_CSV function from the tidyverse. This will read in CSV data sets. We know this is CSV because when we open the data folder, it's a .csv. And then we use the here function to let R know that we want to work in the working directory that we're currently in. When you open up an R project, you're automatically in the working directory of wherever that R project is located. I'm not sure if I read this in, but if you see here for the here function, it says it starts at wherever your R project is. And for me, it's inside my Immerse training folder in my desktop. And in that folder, I have an Intro to RStudio folder. Okay. And so within that folder, we have a folder called data. So we want to let it know that within the data folder, I want to read in the CRDC_LCA_data.csv. And then when you click run, this is just giving us some summary of the structure of the data set. And then you should see here the data set that's read in. We called it data and some information. So if I expand it a little bit, you can see that there are 2,027 observations, 8 variables, and that's how you know that it worked. If you want to see the structure again, you can go into the console, type in structure, data, and then up here you can see the type of variables that your variables are. So we see that the identification variables are character. I was going to change this from character to numeric, given that they are a factor, as in the values represent school districts or schools. I'm going to leave it as is. We could recode it as a factor in future videos, but for now we're going to leave the data set as it is, and the binary variables, the 0 and 1 variables, are numeric, and we can also leave it as it is. One way we can quickly look at a summary of the data set is by using the summary function. So either we can include the summary function within the same code chunk and use Control-Enter to look at the data set, or you can click through this entire code chunk, which it will reread in the data set, and then below it, it will have the summary. What I like to do is separate it just for organizational purposes. So I can just give it a label, summary, insert a code chunk, Control-Alt-I. You can also insert a code chunk here using the R code chunk. And then I'll do summary, data, run the code chunk. And now we have some information on our data set. So here we can see the length of the variables for the identification variables, and then what type of class they are. We know that they're character. We saw that in the structure. And then we have some descriptive statistics on the binary variables. This doesn't really give us much information because we know that there are only 0s and 1s, but if they were continuous variables, this would be more helpful. But it's good to know these functions either way. Great. Let's also look at the variable names. So I'm going to call this variable names. I'm just organizing my Markdown with some text. I'm going to insert another code chunk, Control-Alt-I, and the function is called names to look at the variable names of your data set. I used Control-Enter to run this, but you can also click the green button here. And now we can see that I have 8 variables and their variable labels. This is just a quick way to look at your variable names. You can also do it in the console as well if you don't want to put it in your Markdown. So anytime you want to quickly look at some information and you don't want it to be in your organized Markdown, you would just do it in the console. Okay. The last thing we can do is if we want to preview the data set to make sure it all looks good, or that's the one that we're working with, you can use the head function to look at the top 6 rows of your data set. So we can do that directly in the console. And then now I can see that these are the first 6 rows of our data set. I can also click on the data set here and then also observe all the observations. So these are the first 6 that we see here. Okay. So now that we have previewed, I guess, our data set, let's go ahead and look at some descriptive statistics. Next in the document, it shows us how to look at the summary function, but since the identification variables are not something we want to summarize, let's show how to remove them. So I'm going to just do another headline and call it Descriptive Statistics. And then let's show how to use the select. The backtick in between a word with 2 backticks on the end will show up like this in your Markdown. Let me find it. Oh, like this. So that's just a grade. It'll show up as grade. Okay. So as we saw before with the summary function, we just use data. And then we saw all of this, the summary of all the variables. But let's use the select function to remove the identification variables with pipe operators. Pipe operators are used with the tidyverse, so just a specific coding language within R. There are other ways to do the exact same thing, but tidyverse is just a preference of mine and a lot of people who use R as part of their workflow. So what you would do first when you're writing code is to type in the name of the data set first, then use a pipe operator, which is a number sign, percent sign, sorry, greater than, and then percent. It's tedious to type that out every time, so the shortcut to that is Control-Shift-M. And then that tells R, I am going to have another function right after that. So it's preparing for another function. Right now it's giving me an error because there is no function after this pipe operator. So the next function I want to type is select. And usually I could either select the variables that I want, which would be report_dis all the way to law_FTE. And I could do that. I could do report_dis and then type out each one. So I would go then report race. That's a bit time consuming. You can use the colon to highlight everything between two variables. So I could do report_dis to law FTE. Insert another pipe operator to do our final function, which is summary. And you don't need to type data in between here like we did up here because we already specified that we're working with the data set. So now it's saying within the data set data, I want to select these variables and I want to show the summary. So when you click here, now we have the 6 variables that we're interested in. Another way to do this is to just take out the identification variables using the minus sign. So I would hit the minus sign and then the name of the identification variables, and it'll do the exact same thing. Another way to look at the summary of your data, summary is built in the base R package, so we're not like reading in a certain package to get this function, but we can use what's called the describe function within this psych package. So this is just another way of looking at descriptive statistics. To do this, we can, let's type in how to use the site describe function. So I'm just going to close this. And it's going to be the same workflow. So we're going to use Control-Alt-I to insert a code chunk. And then we're going to first start off with the data we're interested in, the data set we're interested in. Then we'll insert a pipe operator, Control-Shift-M. Then we'll do the select function. And we can just copy and paste this because it's going to be the same thing. We're not interested in those identification variables. And instead of summary, we'll use describe because that's the one we want to look at. Okay, so this one is flipped. So whereas the labels were here, now they're vertical. So now we have more information than the summary gave us. In the summary function, we only were given the quartiles, the mean, and then the amount of missing variables. Here, with the describe function, I just popped it out, the table that it provided. Okay. It gives us a lot more. So we have the mean, standard deviation. The summary function doesn't provide the standard deviation. The range, skewness, and kurtosis, and the standard error. Again, these are binary variables, so a lot of this is not very informational, but it's still good to know for the future. Okay. The last function we can look at to understand our data is the filter function, and that would create a subset of the data. So right now we are not replacing this data set by any means that we've read in. We're only looking at it once we read in, or once we run the code chunk. When we read it, it doesn't replace anything that the original data set provides. It's just a way of looking at your data set in different ways. So to use the filter function, so let's see how to use filter. What this does, like I said before, is subsets your data. So if you want to look at maybe if you have an age variable and you want to look at ages, certain ages, maybe 18 and over, you would want to use the filter function to do that. With this data set, we can look at maybe one school or school district. So we're going to use the district identification code and look at one of the school districts. And so we're going to use the filter function to do that. So we're going to insert a code chunk, Control-Alt-I, and then the flow is the same. We first specify the data set. Now we use the filter function. So I'm going to first type in the variable that I want to filter, and that's the school district identification code. And now I want to specify a school district. So if you open up the data set, you can see that they are presented. There are a lot of school districts. One way you can look at all the school districts is the unique function. And so if I were to type in unique in the console, and then the data set I'm interested in, and I use a $sign to specify the variable within the data set, and then I would click on the variable I'm interested in. So right now I'm saying I want to look at the unique values of this variable within this data set. And now this shows me all the unique values in this data set. So I just picked one at random, since I don't know what school districts correspond with which value. So we'll just go ahead and insert this number so we can look at the descriptive statistics for this school district. The operator you can use any operator to filter. I'm using the $= sign to say I want exactly this function, this school district. But you can use greater than, less than, but since these are characters, not numerics, we would have to provide the exact value. Okay, so let's look at describe. And now we have the same exact table as before, but filtered to that one school district. And now we can see that that school district, there are 86 schools in that school district, and then some descriptive information for each of the variables. Again, this would be more helpful if it was continuous, but since this is just an intro to our video, it's just for demonstration. Okay. And the last thing we will look at is the proportion. So this is actually something that we can look at because we have binary data. So this last part has a lot of lines and a few functions, so we'll go through it. Since our data is binary, it would be helpful to look at their proportions for this data set. And any time you have indicators for latent class analysis, it's good to first look at the proportions. So let's go to proportions, Control-Alt-I, and the first thing we're going to do, like before, is specify the name of the data set, Control-Shift-M, And I'm going to drop underscore NA. So what this does is removes missing data temporarily from the data set in order to look at the proportions more accurately. And now I'm going to do Control-Shift-M to move to the next line and insert the next function. This one's a little more complicated, but this is just going to change the structure of the data. So when it's presented in the final table, it looks presentable. So it's called pivot longer, which that's what we're doing. We can pivot the table. If you're interested in what these functions do, or if you're trying to remember what a function does, you can type in question mark in the console and then the name of the function you're interested in. And then in the viewer pane here, it'll give you all the information that you need on that function. So this is just to set up the table. So I'm going to select the variables that we're interested in. And then we want to call those variables variable. Another pipe operator, Control-Shift-M. We want to group the variables. So when we have it in when we want to present the proportions, they're grouped by the variables, the 6 variables we selected here. And now we want to calculate the proportions. What's nice about this is you don't have to type this in every time. You can just copy and paste it from wherever you did it before, but I'm just walking through it right now. The function is called summarize. And we want to specify 2 things. We want to calculate the proportion, and then we want to present the n for each variable. So I'm going to call it prop for proportion. That's what I'm calculating. And the formula would be the sum of the values. So when you create the pivot longer, you'll have a variable function, a variable, and a value function. I can show you right now. So here we have the 2 identification variables, and then the variables that we're interested in, and we called that column variable, and then now it's created a 4th column called value. So this is the value for this variable for these 2 identification, the school districts, or the school or the school district. Okay. So now we're grouping by variable, and now we want to calculate the sum of the value divided by the n. And this is a function. So it's not specified here because this is a function within base R. And the second thing we want to have in our table is the sample size. So we're going to call that n, and we know that n is the n function. So anytime you see the parentheses, that's a function. Okay, so now that we have calculated the proportions, I'm going to insert another code chunk and make sure that our proportions are arranged in descending order. Okay. And now we have our table. So we have the variables here, the proportion here, and then their sample size. We see that it's less than the sample size in our data set. That's because we have removed the missing data. But we can see that there is a high proportion of the psychologists hired as school staff and the counselors hired as school staff, with one meaning at least one staff present. So something to note, but this is always helpful. So anytime you want to look at this table really quick, you would just change this to the data set that you're interested in, as well as the variables that you're interested in. You don't need to change anything else. One thing I forgot to mention when you are finished with your Markdown And to create an HTML, you want to knit your document. And what we want to make sure we include in the setup code chunk is warnings equals false and message equals false. When you knit the markdown now, any of those messages that you see, for example, when you read in the data set, you had those red messages, those are not included in your markdown. So then you would go knit to HTML. And then now you have everything that you worked on ready. And this is good if you want to send this out to your lab, or if you're teaching, provide it as materials. And it's also just a way to organize all the work that you've done. But I just wanted to make sure that was included. And that's it for the intro to R Markdown. If you all have any questions, please don't hesitate to reach out to us. Again, you can visit our website to learn more and apply for the year-long fellowship. And you will also be able to access the materials for the next video. Thank you.